He said it like it was nothing. Any fresh graduate can do your job better. Go home. The kitchen's waiting. There was a smear of quiet laughter, the kind that spreads when a room decides it likes a line. I sat very still for a second and watched my name sink into the tablecloth, into the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the throat-clearing of co-workers trying to look away. Then I stood, folded my hands over the strap of my tote, smiled in the way you smile when you are taught not to tilt the table with your face, and began to pack 12 years into a canvas bag. I remember the burgundy blazer I picked up on the way out, an old safe color, and how it felt heavier than usual when I slipped it over my shoulders. I remember the LSU mug tucked into the tote, the chip still visible on the rim where the dishwasher had once nicked it. Little things that remain ordinary even when the world has shifted. The mug's weight, the scratch near the handle, the faint scent of coffee that clung to the inside like memory. Outside, the parking lot hummed with its usual Tuesday, cars, cigarette smoke near the exit, someone on a smoking break with their face buried in their phone. I walked to my car in a rhythm I couldn't name. When I finally let myself cry, it was in the car, in the shallow, tidal way that comes after controlled breaths. My cheeks were hot against the steering wheel. The radio was a low, anonymous presence. The tears came because a word had been thrown at me. Not even a justified firing, not an argument, but a dismissal that sounded rehearsed and small. Go home. The kitchen's waiting. It wasn't just what he said. It was the way the room accepted it like a fact. I drove to Mama's house because that's what you do when the map of your life loses its legend. Mama's kitchen tile is cold and white. She has a pecan tree that overhangs the yard and drops glossy leaves in late September. She always makes room at the table. She poured me tea into a chipped saucer and didn't ask for details. She knows the shape of a woman who has been undermined. She put a hand on mine and said, "They can't take what you held here," meaning my body of work, the projects, the people I'd trained and kept. I nodded, but inside, a list ticked off like raindrops. Awards sent to his desk, credentials clipped to his name in briefings, the way vendor contracts had been routed through his assistant for final approval, then presented as his achievements. It wasn't just humiliation. It was invisibility organized into systems. He had been tidy about it. Preston has the talent of making the taking look accidental. There were the public lines, and then there were the small bureaucratic edits, permissions revoked from shared drives, calendar invites redirected to him, the quiet reassignment of projects under the guise of digital transition. Jace Thibodeau, 28, sharp with a camera, technically fluent, was the new digital lead. That phrase floated around meetings like a fresh scent. The word fresh slotted into Preston's mouth, where experienced might have been. Any fresh graduate can do your job better. It sounded like strategy until you threaded together the calendar entries, the access logs, the thin, repeated gestures that removed me from the center of what I had built. I remember thinking, back at the office that morning before the public line landed, that there were worse ways to go than being invisible. Being invisible meant nobody noticed when you left. But being publicly shamed has a different ache, a feeling that history itself is being rewritten with you left out of the margin notes. After Mama's, I went home and walked through the house like a stranger. The pecan tree cast a spindly shadow across the drive. My planner sat on the kitchen counter, a leather-bound thing I had filled for years with meetings, vendor names, campaign goals. I ran my hand over the number of pages I had filled. 2 legal pads stacked corner to corner, edges dulled with coffee stains and thousands of inked corrections. Those pads had been my armor and my memoir, campaign names, dates, metrics, who had signed approvals. I had habitually written everything down in columns: campaign, objective, my role, delivery, evidence. Something about pen on paper makes a record feel less like memory and more like evidence. You have to understand the build-up didn't look like a dramatic climb. It was slow as a season. For 12 years, I cultivated precision. Budgets that were balanced and persuasive, a team that moved like a small army when needed, vendor relationships rooted in mutual respect. We built a $380,000 marketing budget from scratch, negotiated billboard placements in the tightest market hours, pushed click-through rates up by measurable margins on campaigns we pitched as experimental. There were campaigns that won at regionals. There were late nights at PR firm offices watching pixel files render with Walt Tran, sprawled on a borrowed couch, voice low with fatigue and pride. I remember pressing the send on awards submissions, bracing for the extra work, and then seeing the plaque appear a season later mounted near Preston's office door. Those are the things that carve an invisible corridor between the labor and the public credit. Deja knew. Deja Fontenot, who joined me as a coordinator and, over the years, stood in for me in client calls and carried the complicated calendars when I had to be out, sat 2 rows over at that all-staff meeting. When Preston said his line, I watched her face first. The blink, the tightening at the jaw, the way her fingers curled around her phone, as if to make silent what she couldn't say aloud. After the meeting, Deja texted, a single blue bubble, the ellipsis, and then, I'm so sorry, not an apology that could fix anything, but a human gesture. Those small human gestures became the scaffolding when the building wavered. The undermining had started in small increments. Permissions vanished from the shared drive. I would open a folder and find it read only, or worse. The files moved into a space that required approval from an account I no longer controlled. Emails that had been CC'd to me were forwarded without my name. One morning I checked the access logs, and my username read like an afterthought. Last active December. I sent the IT ticket. Silence. I called their line and left a voicemail that probably sounded insistent, maybe a little breathless. Silence. Later I learned that the IT requests had been rerouted through Preston's office. Little things rearranged the architecture of claiming. When a name is removed from the letterhead, the map erases your route. Then, more overtly, the young hire was placed in roles I had architected. Jace's appointment was announced in a meeting that folded around the word innovation like a handkerchief. Preston liked using that word when he intended to remove people. Digital native, he said in a podiumed voice. People applauded because the applause was clean and it allowed the room to believe in a new strategy. I applauded too. It was a reflex. And there is a peculiar survival habit in applauding your own displacement. After the initial shock and the walk home and the tea at Mama's, I did what people do when the world seems unfair. I worried. Not the bright, productive kind of worry that leads to a plan, but the old kind that eats at the nights. I lay awake on the couch, listening to the house settle. The pecan tree tapped something against the window in a slow percussion. I opened the fridge and closed it again without thinking. The supermarket is a strange stage for grief. I stood midway between cereal and canned tomatoes and felt suddenly unmoored, as if food rose had swallowed the day and returned some ghost of domestic security. I cried in the frozen foods aisle for reasons that felt less dramatic and more like a paper cut that wouldn't stop. Days slipped into a different rhythm. I made do with small rituals. The chipped LSU mug got filled at dawn. I walked the neighborhood to clear my head. I joked with Michelle about absurdity of corporate theater. Michelle had been there long enough to recognize the subtle politics in our office. Not the headlines, but the way credit curves towards certain desks. She said, "They put those awards on his wall like they were breadcrumbs." Michelle calls things what they are without making them worse. Sometimes that blunt naming is the most effective comfort. In the first week, I did not act. There was a curious paralysis. People told me to breathe. Relly, my closest friend, came over evenings and cooked until the house smelled like rosemary and onions, sat with me while I made lists of nothing. Rella suggested gently practical things. Document everything, make a trail. Suggesting felt like a small act of faith that the world had mechanisms to correct itself, or at least to record itself. I nodded and wrote the suggestion down on one of the legal pads. There it was, in blue ink. Document, dates, witnesses. It felt both like an instruction and a talisman. Writing it made it exist beyond the moment of panic. Then the other set of small cruelties showed up. Emails that used my language, but attributed initiatives to teams I had assembled. Meeting notes that paraphrased my memos with subtle edits. Budgets that had my line items, but lacked my name on the approval sheet. It was an attrition of credit. It was petty and also deeply institutional. The pattern was clear. Make the person small, then let the system seal that smallness into bureaucracy. And then, as these things sometimes do, it pivoted on an accident. I had been trying to reconstruct the months where things went missing, cross-referencing calendar invites with vendor emails and expense reports. It was one of those late afternoons where the sky over the pecan tree had that particular bruised color of approaching rain. I sat at the kitchen table with my 2 legal pads, the camera lens of my phone catching the soft light across the inked columns. My notebooks are obsessive. Campaign, dates, my role, evidence. For one campaign, I wrote things like Hurricane Soft Launch, CTR pleasant 14%, vendor, bright light, budget, $42,000, signed by Tamson. Another had notes about negotiations with a billboard company and a line item about evening slots we fought for. In the margin, I doodled the initials of people I knew to call if needed. DF, WT, CB. I had been trying to build a map when an odd folder name caught my eye in an old backup disk I haven't opened in months. I didn't even remember plugging that drive in last time. It simply appeared as a mounted icon. Work backup 847. Numbers do not have to mean anything at first glance. They can be a mistake, a timestamp, a lazy label. But once you see a folder named like that after a week of being erased from permissions, it presses on the mind. I double-clicked it, expecting confusion. Instead, it opened like a door. There were so many files my chest went tight. Drafts of budget requests, some with my handwriting in the margins. Campaign briefs signed by vendors with Tamson as contact. An award submission labeled with the creative concept I had drafted at midnight 3 years ago. Spreadsheets with tracked CTR figures annotated in blue ink. There was a summer project, a digital push for a community outreach initiative, with a brief that read like one of my early memos. Objective, target KPIs, proposed vendor, timeline. The thing that tipped me wasn't the presence of documents only. It was the small stationary artifacts that prove authorship. My notes in the header of a budget, a sent for approval line I recognized because my habit was to include a summary sentence. The tiny scrawl on a particular vendor invoice that said, "OK for release T." I sat there on the kitchen floor with the laptop on my knees and read until my eyes blurred. For hours. The rain began outside and made the pecan tree's leaves wash into a soft percussion against the roof. I made bullet points in one of the legal pads. File name, date, evidence type, note. The columns spread across the page like a table of contents for a life. On the first pad I wrote, 847 folder, campaigns, list, signed budgets, award drafts, vendor agreements. On the second, I started to extract direct lines, paraphrased, because I hadn't come into possession of the original email headers. And next to each line, I listed a witness or an attached file. I was doing the thing Rella had suggested, making a paper trail. When you sit with that much material, something interesting happens. The panic thins into a sort of mechanical calm. the rational part of your mind, the workhorse that wrote campaign, briefs, and negotiated budgets, steps forward. It measures, it catalogs, it notes, it knows the language of proof. I felt my old self arrive at the table, the version of me that takes messy data and makes it coherent, objective, methods, deliverables, sign-offs. Evidence doesn't demand a speech. It only asks to be read. I found an early award submission draft saved as Final Pay Drafty Award 2018 Tamsin.docx. The file wasn't perfect, a few track changes left in, but the copy's voice was unmistakable. It was the late-night tone I used when I was too tired to flinch at corporate euphemisms. There were lines that referenced a media buy I had fought for. The vendor invoice was attached. There was a PDF of a budget with an approval stamp that read like a clerk's scribble, and, in the margin, my initials. I scrawled in the column next to that entry. Award submission draft. Vendor invoice attached. Marginal initial proves review. Hours passed. My tea cooled. The rain softened. The legal pads filled with columns so neat they made me laugh at myself. Campaign, date, role, evidence. The last column was labeled Notes, Witnesses, and next to the award submission, I jotted Deja, Coordinated Logistics, Walt, Creative Lead, Rel, Advised on Messaging Early Draft. I don't know if that kind of list would be enough for anything other than salad, but it steadied me. It transformed grief into procedure. It is possible in moments like this to mistake the discovery for victory. Finding evidence is a kind of quiet elation, the thrill of unearthing a fossil in your own backyard. It is not the same as correction. Evidence is only a beginning. What it promises is the capacity to insist. But at that moment, bending over my laptop on the kitchen floor, I let myself feel the small, dangerous warmth of hope. There was something intoxicating about the thought that the paperwork, the messy, boring, bureaucratic stuff I have always loved because it made things legible, could turn the tide. I read on. The light from the kitchen window had taken on a blue dusk. The LSU mug sat on the counter, ring of cold coffee inside. On the drive home from some long-ago vendor meeting, I had once stopped under the pecan tree and made a note in the planner. Build trust. Leave credit with people who will multiply it. I had not known then that the very systems of multiplication could be turned against you. But the documents in that folder were anchors now. Signed budgets, annotated briefs, spreadsheets with my name on the formula lines. There was a file named Bright Light Billboard Negotiation PDF that included an email from a vendor that used the phrase, as per Tamsin's request. The exact wording made me feel as if someone had put a stamp on my forehead. This was mine. I read until my back ached and the house felt uncomfortably quiet. Each entry I catalogued was a small reclamation. I drew a line under one column and wrote the word START. It was less a plan than a permission to do the next right thing. My hands trembled, not with rage, but with a focused urgency. There are moments of clarity when what happens next is not a question of strategy alone, but of self-respect. I slid the two legal pads together and stacked them like a makeshift dossier. The folder's name, 847, felt suddenly like a code that had unlocked a room that had been closed to me. At some point my phone buzzed. Deja, a single bubble. Working on anything? Want me to come by? I typed back, found something, come later, and hit send before thinking of whether it was safe. The house suddenly felt too small for the things I had found. I shut the laptop with the careful motion of someone who knows the value of what sits inside and carried it to the living room like a holy book. When Deja arrived, she slid in without announcement, wearing the soft defense of a person who has weathered too many office storms. She smelled like the cafe at the corner, coffee and sugar. I spread the legal pads between us and pushed the laptop across the coffee table. Her eyes tracked the columns, the tiny blue scrawl, the methodical patience of it all. She raised an eyebrow where I had written "bright light per Tamsin's request," and said without flourish, "That's solid." "You sure?" I asked. "Yeah," she said. "It's you." There is a sober power in being told the thing you already know by someone else. A confirmation that is quiet, but absolute. Deja pushed her hair behind her ear, leaned forward and said, "We document. We call the people who matter. We stay off the stage and make the stage truthful." We spent the evening in small, concrete tasks, scanning certain PDFs, making copies of the invoices, writing down timelines with the kind of patience required to align every piece of paper with a date and a witness. It was not a dramatic campaign in the sense of televised confessions. It was a procedural reclamation, a slow, stubborn aligning of facts. I wrote another column, "Next steps," and beneath it, "Call list, assemble dossier, reach out to contacts." That night, I slept for a little while with the lights on and the legal pads stacked like a promise. Sleeplessness has a way of clarifying priorities. It makes absurd the idea that justice is an explosion, and instead casts it as a sequence of small, inevitable corrections. In the quiet, I thought about how much of my life was made of the paperwork that now sat on my table. How domestic and unglamorous the tools of recognition are: ink, signatures, timestamps. In that realization there was both a fury and a relief. Fury because systems had been arranged to make my labor optional. Relief because, as banal as they are, those systems could also be used to prove me correct. The next morning, I opened the laptop again, and that folder where it sat, like some secret room. There was a file I had not expected to find. A signed budget request, not merely a line on a ledger, but a formal document with the vendor's stamp and a clerk's approval. In the margin, the handwriting that had over the years become mine, small, precise, accustomed to making things real. I clicked it open and saw the numbers line up with the campaigns I had listed: dates, allocations, timelines. There was a field marked "Prepared by," and the name there, in slightly awkward type, matched the way I used to sign constructed documents for internal review. I felt something in my chest shift. Not triumph, not yet. Something steadier, like a hinge turning. Evidence does not speak with a roar. It speaks in the patient voice of paper, proving fact by fact. I began to transcribe the important bits into the legal pads in neat columns. Document name, date, file type, evidentiary note. As I wrote, the rain started again, and the pecan tree dutifully shed its leaves, small green hands tapping the windows. I did not know then how the next days would move. I did not know if institutional correction would arrive quickly or take years. I did not know whether making a dossier would be enough. But I had, for the first time in weeks, the sense that there could be recourse that did not require spectacle. There could be a procedure that would align names with deeds. There could be, in the bureaucratic machinery I once loved and had watched be used against me, the tools for reclaiming what I had built. I set the last check on the legal pad and wrote one word in the margin in larger letters: begin. Then I opened another file with a hand that did not tremble and started to read. Then I opened another file with a hand that did not tremble and started to read. It is awkward to admit that one of the first things I did, after cataloging and aligning and breathing, was to email a short line to a small group of people who mattered. The message was not dramatic. It said, in the plain way my job had taught me to speak, that I had found documents and would appreciate any recollections about dates, approvals, or who had been present for particular calls. I sent it to Deja and Walt and Michelle and Raleigh, blind copying a couple of older vendors who had always returned my calls. Then I closed my laptop and made tea again. Before I could get lost in the comfort of busy work, Deja knocked on my door that evening with something wrapped in foil. She had come over with casseroles before, with celebratory cupcakes after wins, and now with a tray that smelled like roasted chicken and lemon. "You need to eat something that isn't anxiety," she said, as if it was factual. We ate on the couch with the legal pads between us like a table, and talked through how to turn the crammed pages into an ordered case. "You call people, you make timelines, you make them repeat things in writing where possible," she said, "and you do not make it a spectacle." We repeated it like a litany because it steadied us. There are two rhythms to rebuilding. One is the outward noise, emails, phone calls, printed copies, and the other is inward, the small, stubborn insistence to remain composed while you gather the facts. The outward tasks felt like trenches. The inward tasks felt like prayer. Friends began to appear in the ways friends do when they understand the gravity without making it heavier. Rayleigh showed up with a legal-sized envelope she had filled with photocopies, receipts from old fundraisers, a note with a date she had scribbled months before, a list of vendor contacts she had pulled from an old phone. Michelle stopped by and said, "I always thought you were quiet about things because you were methodical, not because you weren't there." She carried a box of the regional award programs she had kept from years past and handed one to me as if returning a lost thing. Walt came in one evening with his laptop and plopped down on my couch like a conspirator. He is a quiet man with a tendency to laugh at absurdity. He had been my creative lead on the billboard project, sleeping under pixel-proof sheets sometimes, furious with pixelation and delighted with results. "We need to build a packet," he said. "Not a complaint, a packet. Show them the work." He had already started reconciling timestamps from their shared creative library and pulling together the files that matched my notes in the pads. It felt less like revenge and more like bookkeeping for the truce. We worked into nights. There is an unusual intimacy in assembling facts with people who have touched the same projects as you, like reaching into a chest and together finding pieces that interlock. Deja called a few witnesses she knew would remember a late-night call or an invoice. Walt pulled rough versions of the digital assets that bore a layer of my rewrites in the file names. Michelle located photographs from the awards ceremony where the creative team had been present, though not acknowledged on the plaque. Each small retrieval was a thread that tied one memory to another. At some point during that week, I drafted a careful, professional note to a woman I had met at an HMA regional meeting the year before. Carol Broussard, who worked for HMA Louisiana and had always struck me as both efficient and fair in her stewardship of awards and authorship. I had scribbled her name in the margin of a planner 3 years earlier, and then, in the press of projects, filed it under people who are good. Now I found the card, dusted off the corner, and wrote. My message to Carol was short. I explained that I was preparing a packet to correct authorship on a past campaign, and asked whether HMA had a process for reviewing submissions and correcting credits. I kept my tone factual and the request modest. There's a kind of professional courtesy in appealing to process. It contains the conversation within recognized norms and leaves room for impartial review. Carol replied within a few hours. Her email was the sort of brisk kindness that professionals trade. She said HMA had a correction procedure, and that if I could submit documentation, proof of authorship, timestamps, vendor confirmations, they would open a review. That reply felt like an invitation. It was not a promise. It was, however, a door with a hinge. Carol asked for specific items, a summary of the claim, supporting documents, which could include vendor invoices, drafts, or witness statements, and whatever contemporaneous notes I could provide. I printed out 2 copies of the legal pads and made additional photocopies of the files from 847, binding them with a rubber band. The dossier I put together was conspicuously homemade, hand-scrawled columns beside printed PDFs. It looked like the work of an obsessive, which, to be fair, is what it was. There was a procedural cadence to the next few days. Carol's team acknowledged receipt. She asked a few clarifying questions, noting dates and file names, and suggested a timeline for review. I did not ask for public redress. I asked only that the record reflect reality. This was, I reminded myself, not a crusade, but a precise correction. Parallel to the HMA thread, I was doing the other work, job searching. It felt almost obscene to look at job postings while the dossier sat on my table as evidence of a wrong. But life is practical, bills are real, pride is practical too. Once pride and practicality align, survival is less melodramatic. I started sending my resume to roles that matched what I had done and what I wanted to do. I was cautious in the way I approached recruiters and prospective employers, transparent about my situation when it felt relevant, guarded when it didn't. The Baton Rouge role came through a contact of Walt's who knew Marcus, someone who had moved to Baton Rouge Regional Health System and was rebuilding a marketing team there. Marcus and Patricia were names that arrived with context. Marcus had been brought in to stabilize the department, and Patricia had been recruited to lead community outreach. The role they were filling required someone who could not only design campaigns, but could anchor a team, translate metrics into hospital administration language, and protect institutional memory in times of turnover. It read like what I had been doing without the erasure. In the cover letter, I wrote a clean paragraph about my 12 years of experience, the campaigns I had led, and the metrics we had moved. I did not mention Preston or the dismissal. I did not make my case in the subject line. I let the dossier and the resume speak. I remember the interview itself like an odd, bright pocket of clarity. It was early morning in Baton Rouge, and a spring light leaked through the conference room window. Marcus asked practical questions about measurement and vendor negotiation. Patricia asked about community partnerships and whether I could work with cross-department stakeholders. They both listened with the kind of attention that makes people less defensive and more candid. I brought my 2 legal pads folded into a manila folder because it comforted me to have my columns present. When they asked about a campaign problem, I sketched out the hurricane soft launch strategy and how we had turned web traffic into scheduled appointments for community clinics. When they asked about team leadership, I spoke of mentoring young creatives, the late nights with Walt, and the small rituals that keep a team intact. Sandwich runs after long shoots, debriefs with cold pizza, intentional overwriting of accolades so a group felt celebrated. The job interview was not a dramatic salvation. It was a conversation where 2 people decided they wanted my particular skill set. A week after the interview, during a rain that sounded like newspapers being folded, an email arrived with an offer. The role was for a small team, initially 6 people, with Marcus and Patricia signaling that they wanted me to lead creative and community messaging. The salary was competitive. The commute would be longer. It would mean different mornings, different coffee, different windows. I read the offer twice, then 3 times. I sat with it on the kitchen table, the LSU mug beside it, the pecan tree tapping the roof like a metronome. HMA's timeline ran in parallel. Their review committee asked for additional documentation, and then for a few witness statements verifying roles. I did not pressure anyone. I simply provided what was asked. Carol's emails were crisp and clear. She would confirm receipt, advise on expected dates, and keep me apprised. That professionalism felt like a balm. There was something quietly restorative about being treated like a fact rather than a drama. A day after the offer, after I had told Marcus and Patricia I was seriously considering it, a voicemail landed on my phone from Preston. I listened to it once, then twice. I will not repeat phrasing he used beyond the fact that he said some version of "call me and we should discuss." It wasn't an apology in the tones I recovered from my recordings. It was a manager's mixture of irritation and calculation. I saved the voicemail. It joined the dossier on the third pad I started, a small, unromantic artifact. My reaction to the voicemail was not blazing. I felt a cool, efficient disinterest that surprised me. The terrain of what that voice could demand had shifted. The dossier had altered leverage in ways I had only begun to understand. At the same time, the thought of going into another fight in the same building exhausted me. The Baton Rouge position offered not only a different place, but a chance to rebuild on a cleaner map. Meanwhile, Carol wrote to say the HMA committee had convened and reviewed the packet. The language in her email was careful, methodical. The committee had determined there was sufficient evidence to update the authorship on the 2018 award submission. The correction would be reflected in HMA's records and in the regional citation. I read the email twice. My hands went numb on the mouse. This was not a public spectacle. It was a correction in a ledger, a name added where it had been omitted. Carol confirmed that the correction would be posted in the HMA database and that she would inform the regional administrators. I sat with that small rectification and felt a modest, fierce relief. It was precisely what I had asked for, the record amended to reflect the truth. To me, in those quiet hours, that felt like karma, the institutional gears shifting to correct an obvious misattribution. Karma came back fast, I thought, but I said that only in my head. Carol's email was not the dramatic unseating of anyone at the podium. It was a paper correction with steady hands. That steadiness mattered. There were subtle, shadowed consequences beyond the HMA correction. In the weeks after Carol's notification, I noticed an uneasiness at the edges, an atmosphere of questions that did not need to be loud to be effective. Board members who had once deferred to Preston in public emails began to copy others in their responses. Gerald Arsenault, a board member who had been imperturbably polite in meetings, shifted from silence to a cautious curiosity in front of the administrative staff. It is difficult to quantify unease because it does not shout. It rearranges the seating. The signal was not that Preston was publicly rebuked, but that the cushion of unanimous deference had thinned. People began to ask for more documentation in meetings. They began to request follow-ups, to inquire about project timelines. The administrative air acquired a new, quieter accountability. It suited me to watch that shift from a distance, like observing a tide change without riding it. I was still deciding about Baton Rouge. The offer required a decision. I found myself in the old habit of making a pro-con list on a legal pad, writing in the same steady hand that had annotated budgets and campaign briefs. On the left, known team, opportunity to lead, salary, new city. On the right, leaving home, commute, leaving behind colleagues who had been my daily weather. There was no scale that would make the choice obvious. There was only the knowledge of what I wanted to steward next. In the end, the decision to accept felt less like closing a chapter and more like choosing the best place to keep writing. The Baton Rouge job promised a team of 6 that I could shape with rituals that honored contributors, that would allow me to set up transparent approvals and a named system for authorship. I also liked Marcus's dry sense of humor and Patricia's insistence that outreach be measured not only in clicks, but in real appointments. I thought about the pecan tree and the morning light at my kitchen window, and how easy it is to romanticize the past when it includes both good memory and almond-shaped hurts. I called Marcus and told him yes. He said, "Welcome aboard," in the sort of tone that makes you believe you are needed. I let myself breathe. The acceptance set off its own practical motions. HR forms, parking permits for a new campus, a start date. I handed in a typed resignation because that felt cleaner than drama. I thanked the people who had mentored me in the office and left with a tote already filled with the frames I would take down, office tokens, a plaque that had my name on it painfully small, the burgundy blazer, the LSU mug, the petrified comfort of certain desks. These were small sacramental items I kept. I took them in the car on the long drive south and thought about the strange economy of leaving. You carry the small things that remind you you existed. Before my last day, word of the HMA correction circulated, not as gossip, but as paperwork. Someone in the communications office forwarded Carol's note to certain directories. It showed up in an internal newsletter as an update to authorship records. It was not a front-page revelation. It was the kind of administrative transparency that registers more in archives than in headlines. A colleague on the marketing team sent me a short private message. Saw the HMA note. Proud of you. That pared-away praise felt like a salve. I handed over my projects in the way professionals do, with meticulous notes and a quick train of calls. The young hires, Jace among them, were professional and in some ways eager. Jace's energy is not the enemy of experience. It's a resource that sometimes needs direction. I spent part of my final week drawing maps of the campaigns, vendor contacts, contract windows, renewal dates, which creatives knew which assets. I labeled the folders with critical and monitor. I didn't tie my sense of validation to what would happen next. The day I left, the parking lot felt like a stage of small goodbyes. Deja hugged me with a firmness that acknowledged our shared history. Walt handed me a thumbnail of a digital mock-up, his way of saying, "Keep building." Michelle walked me to the elevator and said, "You get to keep your name," as if it was a natural law and not a hard-earned correction. I climbed into my car with the tote and the blazer, and instead of driving straight home, I stopped at Mama's to tell her. She set the teacup on the saucer and looked at me with the kind of soft, exact understanding that has guided me since I was small. "You will frame those names back on the wall," she said, and I took that as both a forecast and an instruction. My new commute into Baton Rouge was longer. The mornings were different. The office setup at Baton Rouge Regional Health System was modest but functional. Marcus showed me into an open room with a window that did not overlook a pecan tree, but a sliver of a city street. Patricia introduced me to the 6-person team, people who had not been there when the projects I cared for were built, and who were eager to make their own marks. They were competent, quietly funny, and good at sending clear calendar invites. First days are a mixture of logistics and assessment. I spent hours reconfiguring our approach to documentation. Nothing dramatic, just the steady institutionalization of templates that named authors and that required approval steps to be logged. The rituals were simple: who drafts, who approves, who publishes. I liked the clarity of it. One of my very first tasks was to set up a wall in the team room where we would pin up campaigns, not as temple relics, but as a shared archive. We celebrate this, I told them, and we list names. In small ways, I tried to model the system I had wished for. Credit lines in documents, visible authorship in campaign summaries, a policy to ensure contributors are recognized in presentation decks. It felt like correcting a small cultural bias by making process visible. Meanwhile, the HMA corrected the regional listing to include my name on the award page. Carol sent a short, courteous note to say that the correction had been processed and that the updated citation would be sent to the indexing group. The email included the timestamp of the change and the reference number for the submission. It was administrative, of course, but in the repository of my life, it read like a vindication by measure rather than by spectacle. I printed the corrected citation and framed it in a small, inexpensive frame we keep at home. It was not an act of gloating. It was an act of reclamation. A physical document that said simply, "This work had my name on it." After the HMA correction, I noticed the same subtle change I had noticed earlier in the old office, but now from the vantage of distance. People who had once accepted Preston's narratives began to check and copy their correspondence more carefully. Emails started to have broader distribution lists, approvals were attached, and the old habit of attributing initiatives to a single desk softened into a more granular, multi-author protocol. This was not overnight or theatrical. It was a series of administrative nudges that cumulatively altered the culture. For me, it felt like both a vindication and a caution. The systems that obscure can be corrected by the same ink that once did the erasing. Of course, not everything resolved neatly. I do not want to make this into a fable of cosmic retribution. Preston remained in place. No public denunciation marked the end of his tenure. He left some voicemails and some emails that were terse and managerial, and that was that. What changed was less his fate and more the way the room responded to him. His authority was still present but more measured. People asked for documentation more often. That was enough for me. I did not require a public spectacle. I required the truth to sit where the paper sat. In the months that followed, I slowly reconstructed a rhythm. Mornings in Baton Rouge involved different coffee mugs and a different commute, yes, but they also included the small pleasures of a steady team that knew how to give credit and how to take it. We rebuilt community outreach campaigns with a new emphasis on measurable appointments rather than vanity metrics. We negotiated billboard slots with hard dates attached to contract clauses that recorded authorship. My 2 legal pads moved with me to a new desk drawer and were replaced by new pads with fresh columns. The old pads stayed where they should, in the bottom drawer of my home office, where I could reach them when needed. One of the more curious moments of that slow rebuild was when Gerald Arsenault, the board member who had shifted toward curiosity, reached out. Not a confrontation. He wrote a short professional note referencing the HMA correction and asking whether there were recommendations I might make to policy for future projects to protect authorship. I replied with a list of modest procedural suggestions. Require named authors on all briefings, attach vendor correspondences to project folders, and adopt a regional policy that awards list contributors by their roles as standard practice. He wrote back and said he would raise it in the next board meeting. I did not know whether anything would come of it, but the exchange felt like a small bureaucratic victory. The issue was on the agenda now, framed as institutional improvement rather than a personal grievance. There were other quieter joys. On a slow Saturday, Rella drove down for a visit, carrying a loaf of bread and that old domestic steadiness she brings. We walked past a peak country different from mine and talked about the strange arithmetic of being diminished and then restored. She said, "You did the hard work. You showed up with evidence. The rest is just the world catching up." I wanted to tell her that her cooking and her willingness to sit on the couch and let me list dates mattered as much as the documents. The truth is, smaller helpers knit together the long work, the casseroles, the short texts, call me if you need to cry, and the midnight drives to the 24-hour drugstore for more printer ink. I hung the corrected citation in my home office after the frames I had retrieved from Preston's wall had been taken down and replaced with things that felt true to me. The new frame was not extravagant. It was a modest black rectangle that rimmed a small typed confirmation from HMA. I placed it near the LSU mug, and the mug seemed, in its cracked state, more honest. I walked into the room sometimes just to see the words on the paper and remember the methodical hours of cataloging that had made the change possible. It did not erase the months of grief. It did not erase the nights in the frozen food aisle, but the frame mattered. People sometimes ask me what it feels like to reclaim a name. There's a moment of release that is less cinematic than you might expect. It's a soft recalibration. The body slows, the chest eases, the ability to sleep returns in longer stretches. There's also a kind of practical relief, the ability to put your name on your own slides without feeling like you have to justify it in parentheses. That kind of mundane recognition feels radical in its steadiness. There were practical consequences, too. The new job required me to set up a team procedure for attribution that I now instituted as a habit. Every project would have a header that named contributors and gave a brief notation of roles. We attached vendor confirmations and required a line in the budget printout indicating who prepared the document. These moves are small procedural things that make it less likely for one person's name to be excised invisibly. In institutional cultures, small procedural changes accrue into norms. They are boring tools of fairness, and I like boring tools. Once, months after I had started in Baton Rouge, I ran into Walt at a conference. He had moved to a different design shop and looked, as always, tired and proud. We talked about the billboard project and about the small headaches of creative files. He congratulated me on the HMA correction and the new role, and then said, offhandedly, "You know, they still talk about that campaign in our circle. You put the thing together." His phrase shouldn't have felt so large, but it did. It was a private, peer-sanctioned nod that mattered because peers are witnesses to craft in a way that institutions sometimes aren't. The phrase in the title, "My boss's karma came back fast," is how I talked about these events to friends in the months after. I would say it with a crooked smile because it felt like a way to make sense of the tight sequence. Public humiliation, discovery, documentation, HMA correction, a job offer. It looks, externally, like a comic arrow pointing back. Privately, I always tempered the phrase with the fact that no dramatic, punitive scene befell Preston. The karma I refer to is institutional correction and the cooling of unilateral authority. It is the way systems adjusted when facts were presented. It is the quiet satisfaction of ledger entries aligning with truth. There are things I still carry with me. The memory of the meeting room, the way laughter tittered when the line landed, the exact weight of the burgundy blazer when I slipped it on, the tone of Deja's text. Those sensory memories remain, folded like creases in a shirt I sometimes put on. I do not pretend the world is entirely just now. I do not imagine that every erasure is reversible. But I know now that documentation, tedious, fanatical, exact, is power. Not the power of spectacle, but the steady power of record. One day when a young designer joined our team in Baton Rouge, I sat with her in a small conference room and watched her show me some files. She had a nervous habit of laughing at herself when uncertain. I asked who on the files prepared what, and she looked a little surprised at the question. I said, "We write our names on things. It is not boastful. It is clear." She smiled with the sort of relief that comes when you are supplied with a practice you did not know you needed. "I will," she said. And she did, putting her initials in the header of a brief and sending it out with a tidy approval line. Tiny changes like that multiply. Sometimes, late at night, I still rub the rim of the LSU mug and remember the kitchen tile at Mama's house and the way the pecan tree tapped its insistence against the roof. Those images are not accidental. They are the coordinates of a life I wanted to keep. Home, labor, meaning. I built things with teams and negotiation and careful spreadsheets. The world tried to fold my name into the margin. I took the paper and drew a line. I do not claim to have made anything heroic out of this. I did what felt necessary. I documented, I called witnesses, I asked a recognized body to correct a public record, and I took an opportunity to keep doing the work in a place where my name would be visible. The moral of this narrative, if there is one, is both modest and practical. Systems can be corrected when evidence is presented calmly and methodically, and community, friends who bring casseroles, colleagues who forward emails, mentors who answer calls, matters more than lone heroics. To anyone listening who has felt erased or minimized at work, you are not required to respond with spectacle. There are steady, unimpressive tools, ink, signatures, timestamps, witness lists, that will not make headlines but will make records. If you are in the middle of that kind of hurt, allow yourself the small kindnesses: food, phone calls, sleep when you can, a friend to sit in the kitchen while you catalog. Those things fortify. I will close with a simple truth I have lived with since those days on the kitchen floor with the laptop and the 2 legal pads. The world often corrects in the quiet. It does not always correct fully or quickly. Sometimes the correction is procedural and small, but it arrives. For me, it arrived as a corrected authorship in a regional record and as a job that allowed me to rebuild the systems I value. The name was returned to the work. The frame went back on the wall. I commute further now. I measure clicks and appointments for community clinics in the morning and watch a different tree pass my window on the drive. I am not saved from the labor of being meticulous, far from it. But I have the peace of knowing my name sits on the work I created. If this story touches a place inside you, tell me in the comments if you've ever been silenced at work. Share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet reclaiming, done patiently and precisely, is possible. And if you want to follow along as I keep building, framing names on walls and changing office rituals, subscribe so we can keep this conversation going.